For those of you that have been paying close attention to this series, you might have noticed certain potential areas of exploitability in Ariel's basic game plan. These leaks weren't something we were too concerned about, since a beginner has to start somewhere, and at lower stakes many if not most players are focused on their own cards rather than on their opponent's weaknesses. But part of the development of any poker player is to, over time, shore up the most obvious leaks in their game and to make their strategy more refined and less exploitable. So today we'll be addressing a relatively significant hole in Ariel's turn strategy. As you may recall, her basic game plan only allows for bluffs with draws on the turn, but this raises the question of what happens when there are few or no draws available. One of the most important basic principles of a sound theory-based strategy is that in a vacuum, whenever you have value combos in your range, you must also have some bluffs. If you only have value in a spot and no bluffs, and your opponent figures this out, he can very easily just fold all bluff catchers and print EV against you. Now some of you exploitative wizards out there may be thinking to yourself that you shouldn't even bother with being bounced at these stakes because most of the players are terrible and imbalanced themselves. There are a couple of things I'll say about this. First, balance in the context of poker isn't a binary thing. That is, being balanced doesn't mean that you have to precisely replicate the intricate unexploitable GTO strategy with a perfect ratio of value combos and bluffs in every spot, and complete board coverage in every potential branch of the game tree. Rather, you can add a modicum of balance to your game, not with the goal of being unexploitable, but instead for the purpose of disguising your holdings and strategies, which is important regardless of the stakes you play. Every good player has some level of balance in their game. Anyone that says otherwise is lying to you. Think about it. Implicit in the notion that you don't have to balance at these stakes because everyone else is bad and imbalanced is the underlying truth that imbalanced players are inherently weaker and easier to play against. Being imbalanced is what makes these players bad and predictable. So in our quest to improve, we don't want to just fall in line with the lowest common denominator and play like every other donkey in the pool. We ultimately want to rise above this level, which means we need to play with a more refined strategy. With this in mind, we're going to seek out the sage wisdom of the solver to give us some ideas on how to add some bluffs to our arsenal in these more obscure spots. So we're going to filter Ariel's hands within Drive HUD 2 to isolate situations where she had an opportunity to bet on a rainbow turn to see how the solver constructs its bluffs. And we've tagged a few of these hands to review within GTO Check. In this hand, Ariel opened the cutoff with Ace-8 off and the big blind called. The flop was King-8-3, rainbow, Ariel bet quarter pot and villain called. The turn was another 3 and it went check-check. So according to this solution, Ariel's play here was perfectly fine with her particular hand. But in the spirit of the theme of this video, let's think about how her range as a whole should be constructed. First off, she has plenty of value combos that want to bet here. She has pocket 3s, pocket kings, pocket 8s, king 3, king 8, aces, ace king, and king queen. Most of these hands have a strong incentive to continue betting to grow the pot. However, in this particular spot, she has literally 0 draws, which means under her basic game plan, she would have 0 bluffs to leverage this range advantage and to accompany these value combos. So how does a solver construct its bluffs in a spot like this? Well, as we can see, virtually all of the cutoff's bluffs come from the bottom of the range. And when we isolate these combos, we in fact see that the EV regret for betting small or checking for this entire group is very low. This means that if, instead of Ace-8, she was holding any one of these hands and decided to bluff, it would not be a major mistake. This is because without any draws that provide incremental equity, and without major card removal consideration in play, the primary driver for bluffing will be low equity, and all of these hands roughly share that same characteristic. So based on this, we're going to create an oversimplified heuristic for Ariel as follows. In single raise pots, where villain has taken a passive posture, and the turn provides few or no draws, Ariel is going to bluff 50% of all of her non-ace high trash. And since we always want to understand the reasoning undergirding our heuristics so we can eventually refine and adjust them, let's break this down component by component. First of all, in a single raise pot, each player will have many Ace-X in its range. It will be the most prevalent combo in both players' ranges by far. And when villain takes a passive line, typically this abundance of Ace-X becomes even more pronounced because other hand classes, namely stronger combos and weaker combos, generally have the incentive to take more aggressive actions. There are three paradigm situations when this occurs. One is when hero c-bets and villain calls instead of raising. In that scenario, villain will shed his total trash, and his remaining range, depending on the sizing, will often contain a number of ace-x floats, such as ace-queen, ace-jack, and other ace-x combos with backdoor draws. Another example is when the villain is the pre-flop aggressor, but instead of c-betting, he decides to check. In that scenario, villain will often have a lot of ace-x combos in his range, such as ace-9, ace-8, or ace-7. And finally, when hero is the pre-flop aggressor, but doesn't c-bet, and villain refrains from probing the turn, for similar reasons, villain will often have a significant portion of ace-x in its range, which, given the relatively wider ranges in single-raise pots, will usually have decent showdown value. So in these scenarios, the most prevalent category of hand in villain's range that would most likely fold to a bet will often be ace-high. And since when we're bluffing, two of the most important positive factors when choosing our bluffs is that 1, we have limited showdown value, and 2, we do not block our opponent's folding range. We in turn generally do not want to hold an ace in our hand. By way of example, when we go back to Ariel's hand and add ace highs into this bucket, we see that the lowest EV regret for betting shoots up to over 3%. As discussed, ace high has higher equity compared to these trash hands, so it has a greater incentive to try to realize and get to the river and/or showdown. Additionally, ace high blocks a significant portion of villain's range that would have floated the flop, but would likely fold on the turn to a barrel. To test our heuristic, let's take a look at another slightly different scenario. Again, we're in the cutoff and we raise and the big blind calls. The flop is ace-deuce-3 rainbow, and this time the action goes check-check. The turn is another ace, and villain checks a second time. So again, this is a board where we should have a decent number of strong hands in our range, particularly ace-x with a weaker kicker that just checked back the flop. On the bluff side, we do have some gut shots, but only a relatively small amount. When we exclude trips, only 3% of our range is comprised of 4x or 5x, so probably not enough to support all of our value. But what do we do now that there is an ace on the board? Well, we apply the same logic from our heuristic, but instead of targeting ace high, we target the next class down, king high. In a single raise pot, although not as prevalent as ace-x, both ranges will typically have many king-x combos. Further, on the flop, virtually all of villain's range checked, and on the turn, virtually all of its king high continued to check. As we can see, these hands have robust equity in a single raise pot that is played passively because the ranges are kept wide. When ranges are wide, typically not all hands can be bluffed without over bluffing, which means that some trash hands will need to just be given up, which in turn boosts the showdown ability of a strong high card. Accordingly, after the big blind checks the turn, almost 27% of its range is king high, which makes it one of our main targets to fold out with our bluffs. And so when we do bluff, we generally do not want the king in our hand, because holding a king would mean that we have an okay chance to win, and it also means that it's less likely that the big blind has a king in his hand, thereby making it less likely villain will fold. So, following the general principle of our heuristic, in a spot like this, we would bluff all hands queen high and below 50% of the time. And we see that this very simplified strategy only loses 1.7% of the pot maximum across all combos in this bucket when making a small 33% pot bet. And when we remove just queen jack from this bucket, we see that the EV regret almost drops down to 0. So thus far, we've only talked about unnatural bluffs in the context of a single raise pot. What about a 3-bet pot? In this hand, Ariel opened the button with ace-jack of spades, the small blind 3-bet, and Ariel called. The flop came 8-5-8 and it went check-check. The turn was a queen of diamonds and villain checked again. So in this spot, although Ariel won't have many or any 8x or full houses because she isn't supposed to be slow playing in position, she will have a number of queen x combos that should want to start putting money into the pot, especially after the pre-flop raiser checked twice. So we need some bluffs here as well. It's similar to our single raise pots. On this board, where we have only a few straight draws available, we see that most trash, king high and below, turn into bluffs with a very low EV regret. The problem though is that in a 3-bet pot, ranges generally are much more narrow compared to single raise pots, so the reservoir of trash hands that we can pull from is usually going to be somewhat limited. So in 3-bet pots, another category of hand that will often be bluffed are lower pocket pairs. When we isolate this class of hands, we see that these combos are bluffed around 50% of the time, and the EV regret for betting and checking are both low. So for 3-bet pots, we're going to slightly modify our heuristic to also throw in bluffs with 50% of our lowest pocket pairs. Now, one thing to note here is that lower pocket pairs will also sometimes be bluffed in single raise pots as well, but generally speaking, they aren't bluffed as frequently compared to 3-bet pots. This is primarily because in 3-bet pots, the ranges are tighter with less trash. And when there's less trash in the range, it means that the bottom of the equity distribution is elevated, causing hands that have decent showdown value in a single raise pot, such as lower pairs, to sit lower down in the spectrum. This in turn tends to lower the EV of taking a more passive line with these hands, since they are less likely to win at showdown, which means that the EV threshold for bluffing to be the optimal action is lower. And these lower pocket pairs are often superior bluffing candidates compared to something like Ace-10 suited, because lower pocket pairs typically do not interfere with villain's folding range, which in a 3-bet pot that's played relatively passively will often be rife with ace-highs and middle pairs. Now, for some people, firing with these unnatural bluffs may feel counterintuitive and difficult to pull off in real time, especially at first. Some may be used to the sweet comfort of only bluffing with draws, given that when villain calls, you still have the safety net of possibly hitting a big hand. But one of the benefits of these low equity bluffs is that in many ways, they're actually pretty straightforward to play. If you're raised, you can easily fold and not worry about failing to realize your equity or assessing pot odds as you need to do with draws. Also, if villain calls, on most rivers, these hands will often make the best bluffs because they typically will not interfere at all with villain's folding range. In contrast, brick draws are usually the worst hands to bluff on the river because they often block a significant portion of villain's folding range, which increases the likelihood villain has a strong hand. As such, the solver actually incorporates unnatural bluffs quite frequently into its betting range, even when draws are present, but for Ariel, to keep things simple, we're only going to use them when we have little to no draws available. Before concluding this video, I also want to note the hopefully obvious caveat that this very simplified heuristic will not be perfectly optimal in most situations. For example, instead of just randomizing to bluff these hands 50% of the time, a more nuanced strategy would take into account how many value combos and potential other bluffs that exist in the range. If there are many value combos to support and only a handful of trash combos, most or all of the trash may need to be bluffed. And in contrast, if we have only a few value combos and a lot of trash, the solver may end up bluffing at a frequency that is much lower than 50%. A more refined method of allocating bluffs would also take into account other non-draw incremental equity, such as having an overcard, as well as card removal. For example, if we go back to the small blind's decision on the turn, after the flop went check-check, you'll notice that the suited combos with diamonds tend to bluff with a lower frequency. The reason for this is because diamonds block many of the diamond Broadway combos in the buttons range that were more likely to check back the flop without the backdoor flush draw, and would likely autofold to any bet on the turn. In other words, holding diamonds makes it more likely that the button has some other type of showdown hand that's less likely to autofold to a bet, such as a medium pair. But to quickly recognize these types of subtle details while playing requires the ability to accurately construct ranges on the fly, which is a tall order for someone who has played less than 7,000 hands. In order to get a solid feeling of how ranges are constructed, you need to put in many reps and consciously construct ranges over and over to build muscle memory. And remember, playing with balance doesn't mean that we have to perfectly replicate GTO's unexploitable strategy. It can't mean that, because that's impossible even for the best players in the world. Rather, balance, in practical terms, just means incrementally adding subterfuge and unpredictability into your game to make you harder and harder to play against. So that's the video for today. Thanks for watching. Until next time, stay balanced.